Good to see everybody back after lunch, seeing quite a few familiar faces from the last few UKNOFs that we've attended. Good to see there's plenty of new attendees as well, so thank you. So as you can see from the session, I wanted to talk about some sort of models for effective DDoS mitigation given today's threat landscape. But before I go on to that, I first wanted to start back on the threat landscape itself. I talked a bit about this at the last session in Glasgow, but there's been such a, I guess, significant evolution in the threat landscape from a DDoS perspective since then. I thought that it was worthy of a mention to go back to that. And the last time we were talking about DDoS attacks getting to hundreds of gigabits per second, and I'm sure that a lot of you are aware of that, and unfortunately probably a lot of you are experiencing that as well. But since, in those few months since the last UKNOF, we saw a pretty significant evolution with respect to something called the Mirai botnet, and many of you may have seen that talked about in the press, but I thought it was useful just to put it in some context. From our perspective, what we're seeing is that that's taking the DDoS threat landscape from this concept of having reached hundreds of gigabits to the point where we could realistically start to see attacks in the terabit range or above. And we saw it manifest itself first in a couple of attacks, one on OVH, who's a hosting company, and the other one in Brian Krebs, who's an industry commentator, and I don't know if any of you saw the article on that, but the scale of that attack meant that Akamai, who were kindly hosting Brian Krebs' blog site, effectively pro bono for free, had to actually kick him off because the size of the attack had got to such a level that it was actually impacting their paid customers. So it really gives you a sense of the scale of attacks that are possible with this botnet. Following on from that, we also saw another interesting twist in this. We're used to understanding the typical attack vectors that have been used for DDoS, things like reflection amplification attacks, using, for example, things like DNS or NTP. What we actually saw in this case was the Mirai botnet actually being used to attack Dyn, who many of you may know, are a DNS hosting service. And this changed the attack from being something that targeted a specific customer to one that, by targeting Dyn, actually, for a period of several hours, took out some very significant websites that were companies hosted by Dyn. So Twitter, Facebook, and organisations like that were actually taken offline for most visitors who lived on the eastern coast of the US for the duration of that attack. So that's kind of another interesting evolution in the way that the attacks can be amplified. So what was the Mirai botnet? So it's kind of the first example I think we've really seen of the Internet of Things being leveraged to create a botnet to be used for this type of attack. And I think it's sort of been long joked around. Well, there's been a sort of a joke around for quite a long while about the security guy having the conversation about, is that your refrigerator attacking my website? But I think this is probably one of the first instances where you could see that something like this can start to become a reality. In this case, the botnet was actually targeting digital video recorders for CCTV systems, but internet-facing devices deployed at many locations, many businesses, and many home users as well. And the interesting thing about this botnet is it kind of goes back to really the kind of early days of antivirus. It's actually based on a worm-type technology. It uses code that effectively can propagate itself. So the instigator of the botnet starts off and gets his code looking for vulnerable devices on the internet. When a vulnerable device is found, it gets compromised, the code runs on that device. Not only does that device now become part of his botnet, but that device also then starts looking for other devices that it can infect. And very quickly, this got to the point where there was hundreds of thousands of these boxes all recruited into this botnet. So you can see if you kind of scale that to other, maybe more widely used Internet of Things devices, as this becomes more prevalent, light bulbs, room thermostats, refrigerators even, that can get to the point where we can have an extremely large botnet that is then at the command of someone for very malicious purposes. And the other interesting thing about the botnet is it doesn't necessarily have to be used en masse. So in this case it was, you can take all of the devices that have been recruited into the botnet and point them at one specific target and end up with attacks that are approaching terabits or maybe even above. But you could actually also use it in part. So you could use it to attack maybe thousands of targets all at the same time with more surgically crafted attacks. And one of the good reasons to do that is things like DDoS as a smokescreen. We've seen over the last couple of years some high-profile names that have openly quoted that DDoS attacks were used as part of a broader hacking attack to exfiltrate data, things like the PlayStation Network, Carphone Warehouse. But interestingly, Kaspersky Labs recently ran a survey, and you can see that the results of that, over 50% of the people in the survey said that they believed that DDoS had been used as a smokescreen. And when they actually talked to the ones that actually had some kind of data exfiltration hacking attack, 26% of those said that DDoS actually had been used as part of that. And the point about DDoS as a smokescreen is it's a surgical attack that's using a volume or a volume and duration of attack traffic just to take out a specific target within an organisation. It's not the traditional notion of having hundreds of gigabits fired at a target for hours on end just to completely swamp that and keep it offline. This is about taking out a specific target within an organisation, knocking that out, creating a distraction, while the IT team's focusing on sorting out that distraction. Then the attacker is going about the real mission that they were on, so trying to find somewhere where the data that their customer data is being hosted so that they can exfiltrate it. And typical examples of this, you can get either low-level ongoing attacks that just kind of sneak under the radar of some of the traditional defences that you use, or maybe very short and sharp high-volume attacks that actually have come and gone by the time traditional defences get to kick in and actually start to protect the site. So that brings me on to the subject that I originally wanted to talk about today, which is what are these mechanisms and what are the pros and cons of each of them. So probably the one maybe a lot of you are most familiar with is using null routing. So you have some fairly straightforward net flow type monitoring on your network, and you have specific thresholds set, and when packet rate, volume of traffic to a particular any particular target exceeds that threshold, then you null route that traffic, send it to a black hole, and effectively you've then stopped the attack traffic getting to your customer. But the challenge with that is you've also stopped all the good traffic getting to your customer. And in these days where availability is king, as more and more businesses rely on every minute, every second of online presence for their business, every minute they're offline, they're not making money. And the attacker's happy because in this case, that customer's still offline. It doesn't matter whether his attack took them offline or whether your null routing takes him offline. He's still offline. And as long as they keep sending that attack traffic, he's going to stay offline. So that's not a great solution. So the sort of second tier of that is the more traditional types of defences that maybe you've been used to using, which is typically scrubbing based. You have more sophisticated monitoring, looking for specific types of DDoS attacks rather than just pure threshold based. And when that recognises a particular attack, it diverts the flows for that attack to some offline scrubbing mechanism, which can then receive that traffic, figure out the good from the bad traffic, and try and remove the bad traffic and leave the good traffic to go on its way. I think the animation may... Okay, let me go straight to that. So, and the challenge with that is, those mitigation mechanisms typically take minutes or maybe even tens of minutes to activate. So you go back to that short, sharp attack that I was talking about. You could send tens of gigabits a second for 5 minutes. If the mitigation takes 10 minutes, 20 minutes to kick in, then that surgical attack has still been able to go about and have an effective mission. It's taken out the target within that organisation, and the attacker's now free to go around the rest of their nefarious activities while the organisation is trying to recover that target. So the most effective way today is to do something that's always on. You want to have DDoS mitigation that is actually, I say, in line with the traffic flows. and always there, so that it can react quickly. And there is, automatic DDoS mitigation today. Carrera is one example of that can react in more like seconds and often sub-second timeframes, which means you're starting to squelch the DDoS traffic before it ever gets to any level where it impacts the destination, the target. But there's, putting something physically in line. We recognise, we talk to a lot of providers like yourselves. The appetite for putting something physically in line outside of your edge routers is often not very palatable. So one technique that we're now starting to see used quite a lot is to use something like VRFs. So instead of physically sitting outside the router at the edge, you hang off the side of the router, and then you use VRFs to direct all or some of the flows, depending on what scale you have of your DDoS protection array. And that's the beauty of it, and it also enables you to, if you running a very lean business model, you might not necessarily be able to afford DDoS protection for all of your transit bandwidth from day one. But with this model, you can effectively put an array in place at each of your points of presence and build that array as you, for example, sign up customers to the DDoS protection as a service. So if you use some kind of service delivery model and you start having the ability to sell this onto your customers, the DDoS protection, this DDoS protection array approach makes it very easy for you to scale that. You haven't got to go and interrupt the external inline connection every time. You just increase the size of the array, and the virtual forwarding takes care of it all for you. And then the outbound traffic just goes straight out, so there's no need to interrupt that at all. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I'm going to keep it short and sharp today. So in summary, I think the things to remember. These massive DDoS attacks. They grab the headlines, and they are interesting, and they're frightfully annoying for anyone who's subject to them. But if you look in the overall DDoS threat landscape, they're a tiny proportion of the attacks that are going on. You maybe see one of those a week or one of those a month. Every single hour, every single day, there are thousands of these small surgical attacks going on. So you need something that's well positioned, it's always on, that can react quickly, that's going to help you deal with those attacks if you want to have an effective DDoS protection solution. And as I just talked about, with the VRF approach, you can have something that can start at a modest scale and then scale easily as you either grow your customer base or grow your delivery of that protection service to those customers. Thank you. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. Otherwise, we can move on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.